Hello and welcome to another of the Talk Wildlife Skype interviews. This morning I have with me Peter Blinston, who is the co-founder and executive director of Painted Dog Conservation based in Zimbabwe. So first of all, good morning, Peter. How are you?
Morning, Alan. I'm fine, thanks. Yeah, good to hear from you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sparing us your time. Hopefully the Skype signal will hold up and we'll be able to get through the interview. So yeah, I think, first of all, if you give us a very, very, very brief, because we will go in much greater detail about Painted Dog Conservation, but if you give us a very brief introductions to when it was founded and where and how and who, and then we'll go into its work a little bit further on once we've introduced the dogs.
Sure. So Painted Dog Conservation was, well, I'll start again. The work on painted dogs in Zimbabwe in Wangi National Park began in the mid-80s with an American scientist called Josh Ginsberg. He was joined by some other American scientists and an English guy, Greg Rasmussen, and they were working on basically towards Dr. Ginsberg's PhD. And then there was a split from there, and Greg Rasmussen started working more with communities, and particularly at the time farmers. And I heard about Greg in the mid-90s, 96 I think it was, and I joined him in 97, and then we started building towards what is now Painted Dog Conservation. So yeah, really from the mid-90s, early to mid-90s up to today. So I'm not sure how many years that makes us, 20-something years old now. I'll
let you do the sums, it's too early for me.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share screen. And I have to say thanks ever so much for providing these pictures because they are stunning. And there's some more equally stunning ones on the website. So I can highly recommend your website to anybody that wants to see more pictures like this because they are really, really fantastic pictures. So I'm going to share screen. And what we'll do then is we'll introduce the dogs. We'll talk about the dogs first of all, because there is a misconception around what they are and where they actually fit in the animal kingdom. So we'll put that one to bed first, and then we'll talk a bit more about sort of their conservation. So if you bear with me one sec, I'll just share screen. Right, hopefully you're still there.
I am, yeah.
Excellent. Right, okay, so this is a painted dog. Now, for those of you that might have heard of sort of African hunting dogs, or, I mean, I remember growing up in South Africa, they were called Cape hunting dogs, and then they've also been called hunting dogs. Am I right in suggesting that these are actually all the same species?
Yeah, that's correct, Alan. To be honest, for a species that actually very few people know much about, or even anything about, they've got a remarkable number of names. And indeed, Cape hunting dog, wild dog, African wild dog, painted wolf. But it's one and the same species.
Right, okay, and yeah, I mean, I had the great fortune of seeing them in Kruger Park on our last visit a couple of years ago, and they are absolutely amazing creatures. But what I want to just do is just make sure that we let people know that what they're not is they're not hyenas. They're not related to hyenas. So can you give us a bit of background to that?
Yeah, for sure. So that is a misconception. And even I have to say, I won't name the names, but I've even seen in quite reputable institutions, different zoos, that kind of thing, imagery of painted dogs. They've got a painted dog exhibit, so the zoo they've got painted dogs there, and the signage calls them hyenas. And even in German, they're referred to as Hyena Hund, which is, again, one of the I mean, in English, they've got so many names. And then if you add in the names from different countries, etc., it becomes even more confusing. So they are not related to hyenas at all. I mean, hyenas have no close relatives, and neither do painted dogs. And I like that image that you show in there, which perfectly illustrates the difference between hyenas and painted dogs. And in case there's any confusion, the hyena is the one on the right. Yeah. And the painted dogs don't have any close relatives. They're not a close relative even of domestic dogs. So your wolves, domestic dogs, they are a close relative. Painted dogs are not closely related. And to give a comparison, you can look at the relationship between humans and baboons. And whilst we're primates, and we certainly know plenty of people individually who, particularly if they've had a few beers or something like that, we may describe their behavior as there being a bit of a baboon, but that's still not the same thing. That's the relatedness between painted dogs and domestic dogs is the same as the relatedness between humans and baboons. And that's only maybe a few percentage points genetically, but it makes obviously the world of difference. And they cannot breed, which thankfully that's at least one threat that painted dogs don't have, that sort of hybridization with domestic dogs, which, for example, Ethiopian wolves, that's a big problem with Ethiopian wolves. So that's at least one thing that painted dogs don't have to worry about.
Right. And I will just point out that the hunting dog in this case is wearing a collar. We'll talk about that a bit later, just because at this point people are probably looking at it and thinking, what's that round its neck? So we'll come back to why it's wearing a collar when we talk about the work that you guys do. So we'll talk a little bit more about
that specific. Sorry, Alan, that specific dog there wearing the collar is quite famous because that's Tate, and she was featured quite heavily in the BBC Dynasties documentary. Although by the time they came to film, I'd removed that collar from her because it was no longer working. But that's Tate.
Right. Oh, brilliant. Well, I'll watch that again, because that was a fantastic series. So I'll watch that again now, and I'll look out for the two spots on the top end there. See, just by the shoulder. I'll look out for them two spots. Yeah. So I mean, we've talked about where they actually fit in the animal kingdom. Let's just talk a little bit about their lives. So, you know, a lot of people, I mean, stunning picture. You know, a lot of people will have them sort of almost pigeonholed in this sort of ferocious pack hunting animal that basically goes out and kills anything that moves. So if you could give us, as I flick through for you the slides, if you can tell us about, because they're a highly social animal, and if you can just give us a background to how they live on a daily basis, that would be fantastic.
Sure, yeah, and I just acknowledge here most of these photographs that we're looking through are taken by my friend and award-winning photographer Nicholas Dyer, and we actually produced a book together which has got over 300 of his stunning photographs. It's called Painted Wolves: A Wild Dog's Life, and you can get that on Amazon and whatever. But yeah, you're right. The pups are everything to painted dogs. They're the sort of center of their universe, to be honest. And as you point out, they're highly social. Typically, it's the kind of nucleus of the pack will be a number of adult females, and with the alpha female being the top dog in the pack, and then a number of unrelated to the females, unrelated males. So the alpha female will typically be supported by her sisters, often from the same litter, and they've dispersed from their natal pack, and they've met a bunch of boys who are led by an alpha male, and he's supported by his brothers, and they have dispersed from their natal pack, and then they meet up and form a new pack. And the alpha female is the top dog in the pack, so it's a matriarchal society, and the alpha male. And typically, they are the only ones that breed. It's not, never say never with wildlife and nature, but typically only the alpha female has pups, and she'll once a year, and she'll typically, a typical pup size, litter size, sorry, is around, you can say 10, somewhere between sort of 6 and 12. 10 is quite a typical average number of pups to be born. And there's pack, the entire pack care and feed these pups, and they play endlessly with them. They're desperate for these pups to come out. That previous slide that you showed of the tiny little pup, that's a pup that's about 3 or 4 weeks old, and that's just come out of the den. Yeah, that one, that's just come out of the den at that age, and the pack are desperate for that. So at that stage, you may, if this is the first litter, obviously the pack are all adults, but they're equally pup-centric and devoted to them. And it just, the excitement increases like the next year now, where you'll have so this sort of picture here, you've got these older pups playing with one of the adults, or vice versa. And it's all part of their training, it's part of their social development. They very much have this camaraderie and, you know, almost musketeer sort of all for one and one for all kind of philosophy, with mutual care, feeding. They'll look after the old, the sick, the young. The pups, typically when they make a kill, the pups are the ones that feed first, and the adults will just stand back and keep guard and make sure the pups get everything they need. So they have a very evolved social structure that, to be honest, is quite enviable, and we could learn a lot from it ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously what we're looking here is sort of play. And again, when I was in Kruger, and we saw this kind of behaviour as well, but then we were also very lucky to be up early one morning and we saw this. So the change in the sort of behaviour during play and just being relaxed, from that to being in hunting mode, was absolutely astounding to see, and it was absolutely brilliant. And watching them, they were sort of almost running in parallel with the road and sometimes crossing the road, but you could tell what they were doing. It was the body language and everything was absolutely amazing. So yeah, if you talk to us a little bit about sort of their, you know, their hunting, and let's put to bed this rumor that just kill everything, and because they're not that at all. So let's put that to bed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so they are a pure hunter. They, again, never say never, but they very rarely scavenge, almost to the point where you can say never. So they'll hunt typically small to medium-sized antelope species, depending on where they're, depending on the habitat that they're in. So for us here in Wangi, that'll be typically impala, kudu, down to smaller things, duiker, steenbok type of prey bases, and not dissimilar in Mana pools up in the north of Zimbabwe, where we also operate. But there's a much higher density of impala there, so impala make up a higher percentage of the diet there. And you're right, once it's almost a flick of a switch, you'll see them, and it's best observed in the afternoon, where they've been resting all day, they'll have hunted successfly or not in the morning, but they have a very high success rate when they are hunting. They'll have been resting all day, and then you have this it's hard to see what kind of sparks it. Just they start becoming restless. One gets up and another gets up, and it goes over and greets, and then that escalates into this frenetic greeting ceremony. All excited, they're all running around. It's all kind of like, you know, high fives and hugs and kisses kind of thing, and then they're off, and then they're into hunting mode. And you're right, in some of the national parks where there's quite a road network, they will use the roads. They'll move along the roads, typically in sort of Indian file, one behind the other. But you can see from their body language that it's game on, and they use their senses. They've got big ears. They've got excellent hearing, so they're listening for sounds. They'll be, you know, picking up the scent of the sort of prey species, but it seems to be typically sound that they're looking for the noise from an impala kudu, something like that, and they'll work quite cooperatively to hunt something down. But there's a bit of a misnomer that they run in relays and all this kind of thing. I mean, they don't. I mean, they certainly work together. Yeah. But it's, you know, when they get into a chase, they'll fan out, and as the target is zigzagging from left to right to try and avoid them, it inevitably comes closer to one dog and then another and so forth. But the chases are typically very short and sharp, and depending on the vegetation. And so particularly here in Wangi, which is quite wooded vegetation on the whole, the chases are very short and sharp, and they it's over pretty quickly for the prey species that they've targeted on that particular hunt.
And I believe they've got quite a high success rate. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, you know, you see figures published of 80% success rate and so forth. That's not something we've ever logged and recorded ourselves, but it's high. If they go hunting and they chase, it's very rare that they're not successful. It's very, very rare. And if you say just they go hunting in the afternoon or they go hunting in the morning, they invariably catch something. So even if there's a chase and they don't catch it, they'll regroup and they'll carry on moving through their territory, and they'll chase and they'll get something. But it's typically one chase. But you see big packs will make, like this, that picture that you shown there of Nick's is a stunning one, and that was in Marna Pools, which is a bit more open. It's on the floodplains of Marna Pools there, and a big pack of, this was a pack of 25 or more dogs, and they'll, on a hunt like this, they might make multiple kills. They may kill 2 or 3 impala on a hunt like this. So you end up with a situation where there's dogs and impalas running every which way, and it's actually hard to see that there's any plan and coordination there, but there's a lot going on that, you know, we're not aware of. And almost like a very good football team, you kind of just intuitively know that, you know, that player is going to be in that position, and almost without looking, you can pass the ball and know that he's going to pick it up. They get to that level of teamwork.
They are an incredible species. Just a little
to see them hunting, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this one. How old is that one?
Oh, that's another 3 or 4 weeks old. So even at that age, you can see that's a piece of regurgitated meat. So that, you know, the pack have returned to the den. They'll den. The pups are dependent on a den for about 3 months, And here they're typically born in June, so it's, you know, it's sort of June, July, August, typically, but again, it's not always that way. And the adults will go off hunting. If the pack is big enough, they'll leave one or two behind at the den to sort of just take care, protect the pups. You know, the pups are pups, they're little kids. The adults are more aware of danger, and the pack will return, and then they'll feed the babysitters, and they'll, you know, they regurgitate and feed these little monsters, and they can eat. And even at that age and size, they can eat an incredible amount of meat, and they end up like these little fluffy balls with 4 sort of legs just sticking out, and they can literally barely walk. They pack it in so much. But it's a survival. That's part of their survival methodology. They, you know, when they make a kill, there's no fuss or nonsense or fighting. They just feed. They feed and feed and feed, because they're vulnerable to bigger, stronger predators like hyenas. Hyenas are a constant threat and menace to them. Lions are a constant threat and menace to them. So they just feed without any fuss or nonsense. They just devour very quickly what they've killed and then move off.
Yeah, and then, you know, after the hunt, everything sort of calms back down again, and you know, this picture shows that you know, yeah, basically, you know, they are clearly a hunting dog, clearly hunters, but at the same time, you know, they're living hand in glove with, you know, basically their prey there.
That's correct. I mean, this is a classic scene where, you know, this is late morning, and you know, the dogs have hunted, specifically, I don't know, successfully or not, and it really illustrates the relationship of this coexistence between the hunter and the hunted. That waterbuck in the foreground is not typically on the menu for painted dogs, but certainly the impala in the background absolutely are. And you can see that, I mean, there's not one impala with its head up, yeah, being alarmed, you know, looking at the dogs. The dogs are not interested. They've hunted. They're you know, they're satisfied, or they're just not in hunting mode, and they're just chilling out.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll use that one and this shot here to talk about the conservation status of the hunting dogs. So I know the figures that are quoted by yourself are that there are fewer than 7,000 on the African continent, and it must be said that, you know, these are African dogs. You know, they're not found on any other continent. There are less than 7,000. So we'll talk about the conservation stations as a whole. They're endangered, and then we'll bring it down to the area that you guys cover, and we'll talk about that. So, yeah, endangered, less than 7,000. What's the key threats?
Well, so indeed, the fewer than 7,000 is believed to be the number, and in decline. There's areas where there's sort of a question mark over like Angola. There's a big question mark over populations there. But to put that number in perspective, I mean, around the 1900s, there were believed to be 500,000. So they're down to about 1% of the former population. Even as recently as in the 1970s, more than 3,000 were shot in what was then Rhodesia, where there was still, as recently as the 1970s, there was still this predator eradication program going on. And that is primarily, so during the colonial era, that's where the painted dogs and a lot of wildlife was decimated, and particularly predators. and reducing the numbers to what they are today. I mean, there were fewer than that. In Zimbabwe, where we are, our estimate is around 700 painted dogs, but at one point it was believed to have been as low as 60 or so dogs in Zimbabwe. So they've come back. In certain areas, the population is increasing and stable. In other areas, it is in decline. So overall, they're believed to be in decline. And you can compare that. I mean, again, where we are in Zimbabwe, in Wangi National Park, we believe there's about 200 painted dogs, and there's 40,000 elephants in Wangi National Park, and more than 500 lions. And not that those species don't have their conservation challenges and threats, but you can see that if you're talking about a race to extinction, the painted dogs are really at the fore. They're winning that race, and it's not a race that any species really wants to be in.
No.
The threats vary from population to population, but you can wrap that all up in really one simple statement, which is a loss of quality habitat. And now that loss can be due to expanding human populations. It can be due to management of the land, mismanagement of the land. So like management that is a bit more biased or favors one species over another. Mismanagement where there's just really no management of the wildlife population, which often leads to poaching, particularly. If you've got human populations living very close to wildlife areas, disease is a constant and pervasive threat, typically from domestic dogs. So you get rabies, canine distemper passing into wildlife populations, typically from domestic dogs. So yeah, a lot of threats, a lot of challenges, and then that's all the kind of human-induced challenges and threats, and then they have to deal. In the case of the painted dogs, then they have to deal with the larger competition from hyenas and lions as well. Yeah. And that's where if management of a protected area favors one species more than another, and you get an imbalance there that can be a problem. Very complex, very, very complex, and I would say typically there isn't deliberate management to favor one species or another. It's how these things evolve, and often the less management. You need management. If it's a protected area, by definition, it needs protection, and it needs protection from expanding human population. But ideally, you want that protection to be quite minimal, and that not the protection to be minimal, but the management to be minimal. But the protection needs to be really full scale.
Right, and that brings us on to sort of some of the work that you are actually doing at Painted Dog Conservation. We saw earlier the dog with a collar. This is, I believe, Jealous. That is his name. He's not holding an umbrella, he's holding a tracker. So do you want to talk us through, we've got a few slides that show basically what you do in action. So I'll hand over to you to talk us through that, and when you want me to move on to another slide, just mention it and I'll move on so that you can tell us the story.
Yeah, so this is Jealous. He's been my right hand for 22 or more years that we've been together. So he's a Disney wildlife conservation hero. He's the recipient of the Van Tienhoven Award for Conservation. And he's a tremendous example and role model to so many, not only around here, the villages around here where we are on the edge of Wangi National Park, but internationally. So, you know, with respect to the guy, very little formal education in the school system here, comes from a very, very humble village background. But he's become an absolute expert when it comes to tracking the various packs that we monitor around Wangi National Park and up in Mana Pools. So you're right, that picture earlier on with Tate and the hyena. So Tate, you pointed out, had a collar. Collaring's a bit of a necessary evil. It's not something I enjoy doing. You know, we'll dart the dog, we'll take some samples, we'll fit the collar. It aids our monitoring and observation work, and we use it from a conservation. So you get to really know, and you can actively follow specific packs, and you build your understanding of the threats and challenges they face by doing that. Otherwise, it's quite random. You're just driving around. If you think that a pack can have a home range of some 750 square kilometers, it's quite something to go out on a daily basis and just try and locate a pack. So not only is that aided obviously by the collars, whether we use GPS or VHF collars, it becomes a really, I mean, Jealous is an absolute expert, and he knows each and every pack intimately. He knows each individual. He'll be the first one to say, "Oh, Fred in the Nyamandlovu pack is, you know, has got an injury. He's got a slight limp or something like that." So we may kind of home in on that just to try and figure out, well, what is it? What's causing that? Has he got a snare around his leg, or is it a natural injury? Is there any intervention that is warranted or can be applied? And also through the collaring, very importantly, we'll deploy our anti-poaching units. So if you move to the next slide.
You still there? Yeah. Got that.
There you go. So in and around, so on the Wangi National Park is over 15,000 square kilometers in size, but it's bordered on all sides pretty much, including the Botswana side, by community of one shape or form. And particularly along the northern and eastern boundaries, there's a lot of communities. And that brings pressure. These are typically, these buffer zones are typically, as they're referred to, are typically where you'll get a lot of poaching activity. And that's a big threat to the painted dog population in this area. So we use the information from the collars, whether it's GPS collars that give us remote information or the VHF collars that you have to physically track down. But over time, you get to know the territory of a given pack. And with somebody like Jealous's expertise, there's a certain amount of predicting that you can do in terms of the pack are moving in this general direction. And if they're moving in a direction that we know they're moving into sort of a poaching hotspot area, we'll deploy our anti-poaching units into that area. And these guys and girls are looking for snares. And these are just, it's a very simple piece of wire tied to a tree, made into a noose and set on a game trail. And they're brutally effective. The kill rate is high. There's no shortage of wire. There's wire everywhere in Africa. That's another great introduction from the colonial past. And the guys the guy on the left there of this image, Lepheus, he's been patrolling with us since 2001. He's done more than 30,000 hours on patrol, and he's also a conservation award winner. They had tremendous bush knowledge. They're looking for signs. The poachers, the professional poachers, are experts in their field. And our anti-poaching unit are experts in that sort of counter activities. They're looking for signs. They're looking for where the poachers moved. They're looking for where the animals are moving and trying to locate the snares. And if the snares are recently set, we'll often then sit in ambush and wait for the poacher to come back and then make an arrest. And that's happened even a couple of days ago. Now, these snares, they're not set for painted dogs. They're set for the same prey species. They're set for small to medium-sized antelope, typically. But you will get poachers, they'll set a snare for a giraffe. They'll move into an area, and if they see that it's predominantly habitat, the habitat predominantly suits giraffe, and that's the main presence in the area, they'll set a snare high up in a tree to catch around the neck of a giraffe that's browsing. Now, obviously, a snare that high is not a threat to the dogs. The threat to the dogs comes from the poachers targeting the same species, the small to medium-sized antelope, that in the same forest that the dogs are foraging through. And given the high mobility of the dogs, that they can be here today and they can be 10 kilometers away tomorrow, their chances of encountering a snare are way higher than any other species. So in certain habitat, like on the edges of Wangi National Park, the biggest threat to painted dogs are these snares. And if you move to the next slide, so we currently have 16 anti-poaching scouts, which includes 3 women, and we have these 2 German Shepherd that are what we refer to as our K9 unit, and they will support our scouts on patrol. They can detect snares, they can follow scent, and they're police dogs. They're attack trained, so a huge deterrent if we encounter a poacher whilst on patrol, or poachers, because sometimes they work in gangs. The dogs are our K9. This is Jessie and Natasha. Jessie's the one on the right, and Natasha's the one on the left, I believe. The poachers may be able to outrun our scouts, but they're not going to outrun either of these. And they're trained to grab like a police dog and pull the poacher down, whilst our guys catch up with them. And then we make a civil arrest and take them to the police and hope that they get prosecuted. So we have to work, and we do work very closely with the local enforcement agencies, which are the police and national parks, on these operations.
What I've noticed, I've just been looking closely at that picture. What I noticed about that picture is that the rangers don't seem to be armed in any way.
They're not.
It strikes me as being a bit strict, because I mean, obviously, we've heard recently, that there's been, all right, it was in a slightly different situation, but rangers being killed, and rangers are getting killed by poaching gangs. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a little bit sort of lost word. Why are these guys not armed when you see such heavily armed sort of rangers going out in other parts of Africa?
So in our case, we're dealing largely with poachers setting snares. So they themselves are not armed firearms. They'll for sure they'll have a spear, they'll have an axe, a knife, that kind of thing, but they don't have firearms. We will do, if there's such a poaching incursion, so your armed poachers are typically going for elephant or rhino, and if that's the type of poaching that you're dealing with, for sure your anti-poaching unit are heavily armed. And if we'll get requests from national parks to help with manpower and logistics on joint operations, and then the park scouts will be armed for sure. And if we do joint operations, even for snare removal with national parks and the police, again the parks and the police will be armed. But as I said, we're typically not going up against poachers that are armed with firearms. So our anti-poaching don't need to carry firearms.
Right.